Okay, well, welcome, welcome all. Welcome, Renuka, to this last of our series of webinars on think tanks. Today we have Renuka Iyer. She's the Chief Human Resource Officer at the World Resources Institute, which is one of the largest think tanks there is out there, and therefore has the capacity, I think, to develop this particular area rather well. And so we're very lucky to have Renuka with us. She'll be talking to us about the foundational elements of long-term talent strategy or talent agenda. And I think one of the key questions we'll have is how does a think tank like WRI, but also how other think tanks might be able to attract and retain the best possible talent, something that is always described as a key challenge for think tanks all over the world. So the way these webinars work, I'll give Renuka the chance to tell us a little bit about her experience. I think you have a presentation for us. And then we'll follow up with a conversation, a few questions. And if there's anybody online, I've seen one person joining us just now. If you have any questions you'd like to ask Renuka, please ask them using the chat box in Zoom, and then I'll pass them on to her. Right, so without further ado, Renuka, over to you.
Thank you very much, Enrique, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. I'm going to share my screen so we can move along. As you rightly said, I do have a slide deck, which I thought can guide our conversation as we go along. And as the topic suggests, we wanted to talk today about some of the key elements of the talent agenda, and particularly for the NGO sector and the think tank sector. Sometimes, not as you rightly pointed out, not all organizations have the kind of HR capacity that's actually needed to get the work done. And often HR is tasked with doing more with lesser resources. And so the real question is, how can you then maximize the impact of your work? So, I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking about, what can we do differently? And I hope that in my presentation today, I can share some of my own experiences working with the C-suite and the board, some guidance from the Dave Ulrich's HR model, and also the Society of Human Resources. They have a wonderful HR competency model that I thought that we could draw some of the what can HR do differently kind of responses. And so with that, maybe I can begin. So essentially, if we wanted to kind of do things differently, we've got to think about what are the key elements of a talent agenda and a robust talent agenda. And one way to think about that is when you focus on these key elements, you can kind of think about what's the narrative that you create around the talent agenda. And can you be intentional and purposefully intentional about the narrative? So today, I'm not going to speak so much about, how do you hire right? What are the right tools you use and things like that? But I'm going to talk about what do you do to prepare yourself to hire right? And so, what's expected of the human resources function? This is something that, I think not just HR people will agree with, but also line management will agree with. We are tasked with hiring the right people for the right role at the right time, and we always need to get it done as of yesterday. So we're kind of racing against time. Also, once they're hired, we want them to be engaged and retained with the organization. And oftentimes we get called upon, making sure that there is the right leadership within the organization. So how do you think about training for leadership, coaching, mentoring, those kinds of things? And then, as the employee life cycle comes to an end and when they get ready to leave, then the other question is HR managing the word of mouth when they leave? What do they have to say about the organization? We live in a world where social media is everything. More than we're now finding that more than 70% of the working population is kind of the millennials, and the way they work is so different from what we've seen the other generations work. And so I think that word of mouth is extremely important. Even at WRI, we have about 70% of our staff are millennials. So paying attention to the overall journey of the employees, whether before they start with the organization or even after they've left the organization, I think is critical. And so, given that that's kind of the whole spectrum, you can't really, you kind of have to widen the sphere. You can't really say, well, I'll take care of the employee as long as they're within my organization, but you really are taking care of the employee before they start. So as an applicant, and then after they leave, what is their word of mouth and what was their experience? So given that that is all that is being asked of the HR function, the question is, how can you do that? And maybe one of the suggestions I'm going to make today, or the argument, the case I'm making today, is to focus on the foundational elements. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by foundational elements? I've often thought about the HR department being almost like the sales department for any consumer product organization. Now, you might entertain me or not. You might wonder, what is she talking about? But if you have to say, the case I'm making is, if talent is your most important asset, then you need someone to be an advocate for talent. And that advocate oftentimes ends up being the human resources department. And if it is so, if you don't have a human resources department, then there is someone within your organization that's focusing on talent, if talent is, in fact, your most important asset. So if that's the case, then shouldn't we be treating talent just the way we treat any of our other products within an organization? Now, you might kind of slightly say, well, what about the human side of it and the behavior side of it? And that makes the product more complicated. And so if you have to think about the foundational elements, that's what I'm arguing about. I would think that the foundational elements are to know your landscape. What do I mean when I say knowing your landscape? Think about when you have a new idea, and let's just say there are 5 friends that come together and they want to, they're a small entrepreneurial group, and they are beginning to bring together a product. They have an idea that they want to take to scale. And what they do then is be extremely clear and concise about that idea. And so similarly, they know what the product can do and cannot do. And so similarly, do the HR people know what their internal customers, and when I say internal customers, I'm talking about the employees and the people within the organization, the employees, the managers, the leaders. Do they know what they can do and cannot do? Do they know what is expected behavior? Do they know what is the expected result? And can we talk about it in that sense? Do we know what their needs are? Do they need flexible working, or do they need a certain kind of infrastructure? Do they have to work remote? Do they need training for remote? So really kind of thinking about all aspects of knowing your internal customers and knowing their needs, so that then you go out and create policies and processes that allow for a good human expression of the customers or your employees' needs, and then to think about, well, what's the market out there, right? What does the labor market look like? Are we tapping the right market sources for these kinds of things? So essentially, what I'm suggesting is that the HR team kind of wear the lens of, or the cap of, a communications or a marketing function, essentially to go and find out. And often there is the assumption that HR, once they join an organization, they have to be, making sure that the administrative tasks are all done. But if you really want to impact the organization, that's not enough. You really want to know what is it that the organization wants. So knowing your landscape, knowing what your people need, what the organization needs. And so not only the people, when I say internal customers, the other aspect of that is the strategy, right? So what is the organizational strategy, and what are the behavior changes that are expected from employees to align their work to that business strategy? So, identifying, getting to know your business strategy and getting to speak the language of the organization, I think is equally important. So that is my first suggestion for, the foundational element of putting together a talent agenda that's really alive. The second suggestion that I'm going to make is, again, similar to, kind of keeping in line with the marketing philosophy, is to find out what is your brand value proposition, right? Really asking questions of the senior leadership, including the CEO, really finding out what is it that matters in this organization. I can tell you at WRI, what matters to us is making big ideas happen, right? We're a think tank, but we not only stop with doing research. What we do is we take our research and we put it to action and we test our ideas. So what matters at WRI is making big ideas happen. And so kind of knowing both your internal customers and your external customers, which I mean by is your external competitors. When by that I mean, well, who else is in the space, right? Who else is kind of doing the work that you are doing? What are their practices? And trying to find a way to network, not just within your organization, but also outside of your organization. So you can get the kind of market intelligence you need to be able to influence the brand value proposition. What does the organization stand for? I think we all, as human beings, always want to be part of something that's larger than just the day-to-day work that we do. And so, the thinking about how can you connect the dots? How can I connect the dot between doing this presentation right now to the strategy of WRI? How can I connect my day-to-day? When I get to work on a Monday morning, the first thing I do, how can I connect that to something that the organization stands for? Being intentional about these thoughts, like really kind of thinking about it and brainstorming for it and finding the right response for that, I think is critical. And I'll say, you got to stay consistent with the messaging. It's not enough that you identify a message and then, you say, okay, this is my message. And then you keep it, you kind of tuck it away somewhere deep down in your drawers. That's not going to work. You got to be consistently communicating what's the brand value proposition in all the HR policies, the processes, and reminding staff, here is why we're doing what we are doing, right? And connecting the dots. So that would be my second idea that I'd like you to consider. And as you think about your value proposition and get clearer and clearer and concise on it, you want to think about, now that you have this value proposition, how do you deploy this for your applicants, and how do you deploy this for your internal staff? Is the messaging different? How does your website look like? Do you have the right careers page on the website that can attract people? Do you know what are the competencies that are required? What does it mean to be an employee of this organization? I've often asked myself this question: what does it mean to be a WRI employee? Right? What is it? I mean, why are WRI employees different from all the other employees around the world? And that answer to that question lies somewhere in the value systems of the organization. But oftentimes what happens is you consider, the value system of an organization is considered separate from, what does it mean to be a WRI employee? So connecting these dots, I think, is something that if the human resources function can pay attention to, that would be my suggestion, or something that I would argue for. And then, of course, do that on applicants, do that on existing staff as well. Now, my third and final suggestion is going to be using the power of data and analytics, right? So the question is, why bother? Now, if you want to make change, you want to know, first you have to know the landscape. What does your CEO care about? What does your C-suite care about? What does your board care about, right? There's a very good chance that, and I've just kind of, speaking about my own experiences, I've worked in an organization where it's hard for us to get the C-suite and the board pay attention to what might be required. And so oftentimes I get asked, how do you get them to pay attention? One way to get them to pay attention is by using data and analytics, right? Because it helps you make decisions. So really kind of starting to think about what is the employee information that you currently have? What do you collect? Is that enough? Do you need more? Are you doing enough with the information that you have? And then the question is, as you think about new ways of collecting data, put yourself in the center. I often find that when HR begins to go after data and collecting information, we make it harder on ourselves. For example, we would say, well, let's send out a survey, and then the survey responses come in through emails. Now, if you do that, what's going to happen is that you would have to sit down and collate the information. You're making more work for yourself. So I would say, think smart. Of course, all of us work very, very hard. So there is no question about that. But I think also we should think smart, and we should think about using new technology. And some of the technology right now, given that it's all open source, you might have different alternatives, cost-effective alternatives for using different technologies. So the question is, can you make it easy on yourselves for HR? Can you collect information effortlessly? And can you get it consistently? Because if you are not tracking your data consistently, then it's very difficult for you to look at trends and bring a narrative to the leadership. And then also having to think about, how do you report what you find? And thinking about the narratives. And one methodology that I use is, what I do is I look, there's a lot of data out there. And, the news and the press is always reporting analytics around HR. The most recent one I'll talk about is the Mercers Global Trends, Talent Trends. Now, I don't know how many HR people really pay attention to these kinds of data. There are a lot of organizations, Society for Human Resources Management, SHRM including, that do a lot of surveys and publish reports. So the question is, are we paying attention to these reports? And how do you take the message that you're getting in these reports to tie them to what is happening within the organization? So I'll give you an example of what we did at WRI. We looked at the Mercers Global Talent Trends for 2019. This is a report that Mercer puts out every year. And what we do is we track what are the main themes in the report. And then we create a narrative around what are we hearing from our exit interviews and from our employee surveys. And then we try and say, here's what we're hearing from the exit interviews. Here's what Mercer's Global Talent Trends are saying. So when you connect the two, that creates a narrative. It creates the gap between what is so within the organization and what is so outside of the organization. And every time there is a gap, you will find that your C-suite and the board, they're very interested in it. They're very interested in finding out, why is it that the organization internally is or is not responding similarly to the external forces, right? And what's happening outside the organization. So when you can identify gaps, you will have your C-suite paying attention. But then as you think about it, you're creating the narrative, right? So you're not going to the C-suite, or you're not going to your CEO and saying, hey, here's the gap. You want to be able to say, hey, here's the gap, and I think these are some solutions. What are your thoughts? Give us your guidance. And so really putting the onus for these solutions on a dialogue versus it being HR's responsibility to getting these things done. So you really want to be able to find a way to engage with the leadership and help them problem solve. And we've been doing this at WRI for many years now, and I think as we continue to work on it, it's not a one-time job. It's a full-time job, but you can only do this if the basics are the basics of HR are done. So, for example, if you think about the Dave Ulrich's model for HR, I'll just kind of very quickly talk about that. There are four, he's recommending four different roles for HR, right? So he's talking about HR being the business partner, and everything that I've talked about today is in that space, in HR being a good business partner, and HR being a change agent. So that's the second role that he talks about. So I think that these two fall within the gamut of the work that we've talked about today. There's a third element, which is very, very crucial. And in my opinion, if that's not there, then, everything else that you do, everything that we've talked about today is not going to stand. And that is the administrative function of HR. While you might say, well, that is very repetitive and that is very boring, let me just tell you that is the most crucial. That's the backbone on which you can then go out and do a lot of the upstreaming work. So HR folks have to be administrative experts. And so paying attention to that and making it easier on ourselves, I think, is the trick. And then finally, in his model, he's talking about HR being an employee advocate. And I think you could do that when you think about, crafting the narrative so that it becomes not just HR's problems, but it becomes the organization's problem, and that we're problem solving it together. So that's really what I have. The question is, what are you willing to try out in 2020? We're kind of getting ready to welcome the new year and to think about your own HR work that you've been doing in the past and the challenges you're having, to think about what are some things that you will try out in 2020. And well, if it works, great. If it doesn't, that's all right. We're on a continuous learning journey, and we can always think about what else might work. Enrique, I wonder if we should open it out for questions at this time.
Sure. I will. So if anybody online has a question, please do write the question in the chat box, and I will ask it to Renuka. But let me start with a couple of comments or questions from my side, if that's okay. I think you can stop sharing the screen if you prefer. But one of the things that struck me in your presentation is the fact that HR is connected to two other key functions in the organization. Let's say the governance and management of the organization, and then communications. Right? When you are trying to develop or communicate the value proposition of the organization, the narrative of the organization that is going to attract the right people, or the right people for the organization, that's going to retain them. Of course, you have to have an input in what the communications team or the communications function of WRI is thinking about when they're putting content out there. Right? The way they communicate, the style of their communication will clearly portray, that essence of WRI that you'd like your future staff to keep in mind. And the same way, when you were talking about the needs, the expectations of staff, and how policies and processes have to respond to them, of course, that might lead to discussions around whether the business model of the organization is appropriate for a healthy, happy, productive, engaged workforce, right? And I often find that we're trying to do it the other way around. We find organizations that have governance structure, management structure, processes, and policies that are not very good for that engaged, happy, productive workforce. And they're trying to find staff that will deal with it, that will accept that, rather than the other way around, right? Do you have that? I mean, do you feel that as a chief HR officer, you are having these conversations with senior management? Where do you think there is space for you in your role to influence their own work and the way they lead their functions, whether it's management or communications?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So absolutely yes is the answer. While it might not be part of my job description to do that, I think when you think about accountability, you got to take it upon yourself, because what you create, so it's the way to think about it is to think about, what conversations are you in and what conversations are you not in? And sometimes the conversations you are not in can impact you in the longer run more than the conversations that you are in, right?
Mm.
So finding a way to infuse yourself into those conversations that you are not in. And as an example, I'll give you two examples. The first one is HR actively participating in the creation of the strategy, right, of the organization? Oftentimes, the strategy is written with the programmatic lens. And so as you're reading those materials, those documents, are you wearing the HR hat and thinking about, well, what are they really saying here, right? What's the kind of skill they're asking for? What is different? What's not here right now that might be needed to call upon? So actively engaging in the creation of the strategy for the organization is one. And then the second one is actively engaging in proposal development, for example. As we go out and think about, requesting for funds to a donor, how engaged is HR in thinking about proposals? And are we able to influence that? Can we bring data to the table that the senior leadership may be interested in? And when they are interested in, they will automatically invite us, right, to those conversations. I think it's very, very essential and crucial. And I can just say this out of my own career and what I followed in my life. I've always made sure that HR has a great relationship with the communications department and with all other operations department, the finance, the accounting, the IT. It's very, very, very important that HR maintains a great relationship with all the departments that support the organization. In fact, I have a personal theory. I'm sure, when I say it, you might think I'm crazy or something. But my personal theory is that if HR cannot have those personal relationships within teams, then how are you going to be able to get all the other teams to work together? If HR can't work together, how are you going to get the other teams to work together, right? And so my theory is that the organization mirrors the relationships that HR has. So if you want to change something about the organization, change your own department first. And even if you were a department of one, that's still a department. So, I think that I've learned to start in my own house first. And then once I get that going, then that becomes a model. I've often seen that then becomes a model. People notice that something is working. So that becomes a model for the others. So so definitely, yes, you want to be in those conversations. And oftentimes you're not going to be invited, but find a way to get an invitation or offer information that will allow you to get an invitation.
And what about the relationship with not the support teams, but the program teams, so the researchers themselves, sort of addressing? Going back to my own experience working for a think tank, I remember when I left, having been head of a program, one of the things that I thought about is that I had spent a very difficult year sort of keeping up with new demands. And one of the reflections I had was that had I had some support, possibly from HR, in for HR, let me know that I was going to run into trouble if I did not sort of find the right people to join my team. I would have avoided that situation, right? So I felt that one of the roles that HR could have had in helping me was to tell me early on, you're making the wrong choices about your staffing structure for your program. You know, you need to hire more senior staff or more junior staff. This is what's going to help you address the challenges that are coming up, right? Now, this is not to blame them, but I did feel that this wasn't part of their job description, and I did not know how to ask for it. Do you have any experiences where that's a role you've played or your team has played, and what could be done to make sure that the HR department, whether it's a one person or a whole team, is able to contribute directly to the researchers? And is it taking into account that I know, having been a researcher, that we often think we know better, right? And we're the least likely to ask for help in a think tank.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And yes, I do have a lot of experience in that area. It's about the first foundational element I shared with you, right? Knowing the landscape. So let me ask you, as a program director in your previous organization, you were doing work on nonprofit, you were in the nonprofit sector. But if you were to do something on rocket science, for example, you would need help, right? To learn that area. And so similarly for HR, we do work with we are the, how do I say this? We kind of know the processes around recruitment, around the employee life cycle, but we don't know anything about the programmatic work that program directors do. So that is like rocket science to us until we actually go and find out what that is and learn about it and take the time to do it. When you learn about it enough to be able to speak in that language, you don't even need to know the details, but to be able to speak in that language, I think that HR will have the ears of the program directors. So an example that I can share is we have exit data, right? When people leave the organization, we're collecting, we always do a survey, we collect survey, and from the survey responses, every end of the year, I do a report. I look at exit surveys and I look at Glassdoor surveys, right? Now for Glassdoor surveys, you don't even need, even if you didn't have an exit survey, let's just say that you were a department of one, you're a very small NGO, you're a department of one, and you don't have an exit survey mechanism. Well, you can always look at Glassdoor surveys because people are always—
What is that, sorry?
Glassdoor,
Yes.
Glassdoor. Here in the US, it's a online a portal where employees will just go and share their views about their organization, about how their experience was with interviewing with this company. So there is a lot of information about your organization on the intranet, right? On the internet. And so the question is, are you looking for that information? So if you have that information, let's just say in this case, let's say that if we were finding that there were a lot of exits in a particular program, we can go to that program director and say, hey, you know what? We found that 60% of the employees that left last year were from your department. Guess what? You have their year almost immediately. And, and then they'll start talking about their pain, because the pain is that they are training people constantly and there is a churn, right? And when you have their year, then you can influence the work that they do. You can make sure that they're hiring right. You can put in place mechanisms, like you can bring your behavioral interviewing card out and say, well, have you thought about behavioral interviewing? Why don't I train you on how you do behavioral interviews? And so you can do things in HR if you have that opening. And to have that opening, I'm arguing that you have to have data.
Because that will get them to pay attention and
Yes.
to be willing to listen. But as I said, I think what you're describing is also a very proactive role of the HR team, right? Of looking for information, looking for opportunities to work with different departments, whether there's support for programmatic, and complementing their work and their own expertise. There's something else that you mentioned, which I thought was also quite interesting, and I think you've talked about this. Being open, sharing information, sharing narratives, sharing your values. And one of the things that we come across a lot when it comes to think tanks, and this is particularly true for think tanks in contexts where social norms are very hierarchical. They suggest a very hierarchical structure. And we find that often organizations are struggling. They're finding it very hard to get the new programs, new work, new income, or they're finding it hard to find the right people to join their organizations. And they rarely share this information with their staff. So they rarely open up processes or spaces where they might tell the staff, this is the financial situation of the organization. These are the challenges we're facing. What can you do about that? It's not just about us, the senior management, but it's also about the entire organization. Do you think there's a role for HR or for an HR function in mediating these conversations, making sure that they are more open, transparent, two-way, etc.? And how would you go about that?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I think it's critical. Again, this is one of those conversations that HR does not get invited to, right? But when things go south, then the HR function is the one that's, I'll just use the word blamed. And so the question again is, how do you go about influencing that, right? I'll give you an example. Actually, we're doing a lot of work at WRI right now about diversity, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And okay. The question is, how do we influence the thinking around this? And why? The question is, why are we doing work around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Like I said, 70% of our staff are millennials, and the new age is all about transparency, is all about making sure that that it is all about accountability and transparency, right? So paying attention to that and getting involved in those conversations again is critical. I'm sorry that I'm going to come back to those three pieces that I talked about. It is about knowing your landscape, right? So making sure that you understand what it means when you are going after any question or any problem that's happening within the organization. You understand what is it that your employees are asking for. You understand what is it that your management is asking for. You identify the gaps and speak to the gaps. So I think the response is just that, is knowing how much do you know, what else do you not know, that's not allowing you to allowing you be effective. And then the only other thought I have as you were asking that question is, do we have a problem-solving mindset? At WRI, I think we are a think tank, and as a think tank, we hire people who are critical of data and analytics, right? Because that's how you make your work more robust. You think through all the different parameters and you put out there reports and studies that actually are independent and strong with research. So as an organization, we hire people who are very critical. And so when you hire people who are critical, the automatic mindset is to blame, right? But you can blame the past. You can't do anything about it. It's gone. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of change that mindset from it being a blaming mindset to a claiming the future mindset? And I think it's important that HR people, whether you are in senior position within HR or whether you're anywhere in HR, you got to be able to learn the language of the future. And the way to learn the language of the future is if you know what is the strategy, what is your mission, right?
Yeah.
If you want big ideas if you want big ideas to make happen, then how do you then define everything to kind of back that up? So I think that the answer to that question kind of lies in there, to change the mindset of the organization.
And so, as a way of kind of bringing it all together, all these functions you mentioned these four roles: a business partner, the administrative function, the change agent function, the employee advocate, etc. The connection between HR and communications and senior management, but also programs, helping develop the values, etc. What kind of organization that is quite small or works in a context where the market for talent is also quite small? There aren't that many options when it comes to finding the best possible people. They're struggling with resources. As you mentioned before, the first ones to be blamed might be HR, but also in some organizations, when money is short, the first ones to go tend to be from the central services, and that could be HR or communications, for example. What can a small organization do to incorporate some of these roles you've mentioned, and to incorporate these sort of foundations of a talent agenda?
Yeah, I think to stay compliant, as an organization, if you want to stay compliant and want to avoid, at least here in the United States, any legal laws, or if you want to stay compliant, then I think you have to pay attention to those four roles, whether you're in HR or not, whether you have an
Right.
HR function or not, right? You want to pay attention to it. So I don't think that those four roles that I talked about are roles that you can ignore. If you are the CEO of an organization, you got to be paying attention to those, right? And so I agree that in organizations that are small, it's a challenge. And that is another reason why, if you're not very clear about what you need and what you have to offer, right? If you're not very clear about that, then people won't come to you. It's very similar to think about. I began my conversation around these five friends that come together and they have an idea, right? Now, when you sell that idea, at that time nobody knows you. Nobody knows your idea. Mm-hmm. So if you're not very, very clear about what that idea is and how it's going to shape the future, you're not going to be able to attract people's attention. So asking those questions of when you're a smaller organization, paying attention to the talent function and asking those questions of ourselves. Why do we exist? What are we here to do? If we are here, I've worked in organizations that are implementing organizations, which means that you get a donor funding to implement a certain thing, and then when the donor funding is over, then the implementation stops, and you go on from that project to another project. And this was the question. I mean, what is it that you have to offer? Well, you may have to offer a great implementation a team that can come in together and in 2 years deliver the impact that is required and then get off, right? So kind of really being clear of what is it that you offer, I think is critical to be communicate that. Whether the HR functions communicates that, or if you don't have an HR function, whether the C-suite is communicating that. Someone has got to be communicating that. Unless you're very clear about it, and unless you communicate consistently, knowing your brand value and communicating it consistently, unless you do that, then you're not going to be able to attract talent. And then paying attention to, I know that we are hard pressed for resources, but paying attention to where is the money going, right? What's the talent you're attracting? And is there a good mix of investing the limited resources you have on people and systems? I think that is another crucial question we're asking ourselves.
Okay, that's very clear. I always feel that sometimes we blame the people we've hired for not delivering what we hoped that they would deliver, but it was probably that we didn't explain what we needed in the first place, and therefore we didn't find the right people for the job rather than the right people. And it's on us to make that clear, and not just to our current staff, but also to our future staff.
Yeah.
So that was very. Sorry, go ahead.
Sometimes when we know what we want, we hire, and then when what we want changes, we don't communicate that. So make
Right.
sure when it changes, communicate that. So
Right.
people know whether they still want to be on the bus or whether this is not something for them, or they can shift their priorities.
And to be clear, right? Not to expect people to read in between the lines of how the leadership is behaving or what the organization is doing, but be clear about what their role might be like in the next few months or years, if nothing happens and nothing changes. So that was very interesting. I think that's HR is one of those roles that we at On Think Tanks have not paid enough attention to. Partly because many organizations don't have an HR team, but it's clear one that whether it's through a team or through just adopting the roles is fundamental for any think tank. That, as you said, it's for its biggest asset, it's its people, and without its people, it's not going to come up with any interesting research and any useful advice. So that was very useful. Thank you very much for giving us your time today. And so we'll be sharing this video with our audiences through our newsletter, social media, and if anybody has any questions, any comments, I'm sure you can join online in the conversation. Thank you, Renuka, and I hope to see you soon and follow up this discussion again.
Thank you so very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts. And yes, I'd be very interested in continuing the conversation with anyone that has any questions.
Great. Thank you very much. So, goodbye.